One of the most interesting things to note while exploring the ruins of America in The Last of Us is that there seems to be a story behind every facet of the environment. From hastily packed bags that were never taken to a puddle of blood underneath bullet holes on a wall. Most of these are just short glimpses into a larger picture, but when a bunch of these come together, they form an overarching narrative of the area that describes the experience of what the people there went through. The town of Lincoln is a perfect example. As Joel and Ellie explore the town, they learn portions of its story, from what life was like at the outset of the pandemic, the panic that ensued as reality set in, and the aftermath from the devastation from 20 years before. They also learn that the story of Lincoln is still ongoing, thanks to the hermit that lives in the town, the lone wolf whose personal story is deepening the narrative of the area. Meaning that even after their own experience with the town is over, the history of Lincoln will still be marching on. But before we get to that, we have to start at the beginning. The town of Lincoln wasn't unlike most other towns in America. The people went to work or school through the week, and when the weekend rolled around, adults would catch a drink at Patton's while kids would rush to Anthony's Pizza and Subs to get a meal and play the arcade game in the dining room. On Sunday, people would go to church in their Sunday's finest, and on Monday, they went back to school or work, repeating the cycle that was simple town life. But all of that changed in the autumn of 2013. The cordyceps brain infection was tearing its way across America, and it wouldn't be too long before the ravenous army found its way to Lincoln. Some residents wanted to get ahead of the horde and flee to one of the quarantine zones set up in one of the cities of the Northeast, like Hartford or Boston, where the military could protect them. But others resisted the move, convinced that the pandemic would miss their small, out-of-the-way town, and refused to give up their homes to the panic. Despite their stubbornness, however, the decision to leave was eventually made for them. In October, the military imposed a mandatory evacuation of the town, only allowing residents to bring one bag of belongings, whereupon they would be loaded onto buses to be carted off to one of the various quarantine zones in the area. Although some continued their resistance, the evacuation moved along smoothly until the unexpected arrival of a mass of infected. As panic overwhelmed those that remained, the buses were abandoned, and those unlucky enough to have still been in the town during the attack were killed by the monsters, or became one themselves. Thus, Lincoln was deserted by the living, left as a domain for the infected. Over the years, as Mother Nature began to reclaim the town of the infected, humanity started to find its way back to Lincoln in search of supplies that had become scarce in the various communities of the region. In particular, two men named Bill and Frank set up shop in Lincoln sometime shortly before 2033. They created a safe house in one of the churches and got to work building a perimeter of safety around it. They cleared out several of the buildings surrounding the church and burned the bodies of those they killed. They built a fence that cordoned off the section of town where a high number of dangerous infected lived. They laced the alleys of Lincoln with homemade explosives that would shred anyone that tripped them. But it wasn't just the infected they had to deal with. On occasion, other survivors would find their way to Lincoln looking for supplies or a place to live and disrupt their routine, setting off the traps and riling up the infected. The high number of monsters that lived there was usually enough to scare them off, but as an additional measure, Bill and Frank wrote various warnings across the town to let any survivor know they were not invited in. It wasn't always other random survivors though, as every few weeks, the military would ride through Lincoln looking for supplies themselves. But they didn't know their way around like Bill and Frank did, and would often stray into the more dangerous parts of the town. One time, their ignorance cost them. While driving past the high school, their caravan was overrun by infected, and one of their trucks crashed into the side of the school. Those that lived through the crash didn't live much longer than that. These were the ever-present dangers hanging over Bill and Frank nearly every day of their lives. Bill was the sort to rarely take risks, whereas Frank was more laid back and relaxed. As such, Bill felt like he had to be on the lookout for both of them and was super strict with Frank, to the point of being a control freak. Nonetheless, he was very appreciative of his partner, and together, they looted the ruins of the town, picking up various items left behind by its previous occupants that had become especially valuable after the fall of society. Things like medicine and ammo were always in high demand, and the duo would provide the resources they found to smugglers who would sneak the goods into one of the various quarantine zones in the area. It was a hard life, but they were alive. The two talked sometimes of leaving Lincoln. Bill frequently bemoaned the battery in the wrecked Humvee. How if it wasn't surrounded by so many infected, they could repurpose the battery and fit it into another car they could use to leave. But those were never more than hypothetical conversations. More what-if scenarios than actual plans. But to Frank, that's exactly what they were. He was sick and tired of life in Lincoln, of all the emptiness, of always having to look over his shoulder, and of Bill's stifling, set-in-his-ways attitude. He wanted more from life than what Lincoln had to offer, and when it became obvious that Bill wouldn't take the risk to leave town, Frank started getting things prepared for himself. He got in contact with one of their partners and organized his infiltration into Boston's quarantine zone as a fully fledged resident with all the proper paperwork. All he would have to do is meet his contact in the old subway station by the Capitol building. So he gathered supplies, secretly taken from his and Bill's stash, and then left Bill behind forever. His disappearance was very distressing for Bill, who had lost his friend, his partner. Bill wasn't the type to get sentimental, however, and in order to cope with the loss, he rationalized he was better off without having to babysit Frank all the time. Without Frank holding him back, Bill could focus on surviving. And survive he did, until one day someone wandered into his town, ignoring his warnings and doing all of the things he hated. He eventually found that his intruder was one of the smugglers he partnered with, a man named Joel who had a job to transport the young girl he was traveling with, Ellie. He had come to Bill because he needed a car, and called in some favors to get him to comply. Bill told Joel about the crashed Humvee at the high school that likely still housed a battery, but also about the danger they'd face getting to it. They stocked up on supplies at Bill's safe house, and set off, making their way through the crowds of the infected that permeated the suburbs, and fighting their way past more of the monsters that lingered outside of the school. Once inside, they opened the hood of the vehicle to find the battery missing. But before they could investigate further, the swarm of hungry infected forced them to retreat. After narrowly avoiding death at the hands of one of the rarest forms of infected, the trio took shelter in one of the houses close by and started arguing about their plan, when Bill stopped, noticing a body hanging from a noose. The body of Frank. As Bill chopped him down, he noticed the bite marks. Evidently, his escape hadn't gone as smooth as he had hoped, and wanting to go out on his own terms, he hanged himself so he didn't become one of the infected. If Joel explores the house a bit, he can find a note Frank wrote before his death, where he revealed his true feelings for his partner. It's up to Joel whether he chooses to give it to Bill or not. In the garage, they discovered what happened to the missing battery. In Frank's attempt to make it to the Capitol building, he had successfully taken the battery from the wrecked Humvee and put it into a truck. Though the effort had cost him his life, it wasn't all in vain, as Bill, Joel, and Ellie were able to use the truck to make it out of the infected-laden suburbs and live Frank's dream of escaping from Lincoln. Bill didn't join Joel and Ellie, however, getting dropped off at one of his safe houses, giving some parting words,
and get the fuck out of my town.
And remaining in his town. And that ends the tale of Bill, Frank, and the town of Lincoln. They are a showcase of the impressive world Naughty Dog built in The Last of Us. The characters and locations have unique, persistent stories that existed before Joel and Ellie interacted with them, and continue to exist afterwards. It's doubtful we'll hear anything about Bill or Lincoln in The Last of Us Part 2, but hearing how the stubborn, belligerent resident of Lincoln is doing would be a nice touch. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments or anything, feel free to share. I'd be happy to hear from you. But that's all for this one. Thank you for watching, and see you later.